Great. Well, I'd like to thank Francesco and Mariangela and the rest of the scientific committee for helping us get all here and for inspiring us with this conference theme of occupied spaces, which has, I think, challenged us all to think very deliberately about the spatial aspects of military occupation. And indeed, the call for papers inspired me to revisit some sources that I had written about in the past. Military propaganda service newspapers for Italian troops in the occupied zones of Yugoslavia during the Second World War. Now, previously, I had considered these sources through the lenses of nationalism, racism, and religion. And I made reference to the ways that stereotypes about the Balkans reinforce these interpretations, but I had never placed these representations of the Balkans as space at the center of my analysis, or fully explored the dynamics behind their entanglement with racism and expansionism. So my paper today attempts to do that by examining these propaganda sources through the lens of the spatial imaginary of the Balkans. So spatial imaginaries are textual, visual, or performative representations that, while fluid in their contents and meanings, tend to reduce complexity and shape identities by homogenizing space. They provide an essentializing framework for making sense of space, and they are rarely value neutral. One of the classic examples of a spatial imaginary is the pan-European discourse on the Balkans. In the late 1990s, Bulgarian historian Maria Todorova outlined the historical development of this discourse and described a paradigmatic framework which she labeled Balkanism. Now, this Balkanist rhetoric tended to define the Balkans as a backward, primitive, barbarian, and violent space plagued by tribalism, but also as a liminal space on the periphery of Europe, a bridge between East and West that was semi-colonial, semi-civilized, and semi-oriental, emphasizing the legacy of Ottoman rule over the region. So it's Todorova's framework that I have adopted and applied to the analysis of my propaganda sources. Now, although Todorova's study did not utilize Italian sources, it's clear that the influence of the Balkan imaginary that there was a significant influence of this Balkan imaginary on Italian counterinsurgency practices and propaganda. My paper shows first that the army adopted a spatial imaginary of the Balkans at the official level that informed its policy and strategy in Yugoslavia. And second, that this imaginary manifested itself then in the army's propaganda in three main aspects: geopolitical, topographical, and ethno-racial. So first, I argue that the army leadership brought with them to Yugoslavia an already well-entrenched image of the Balkans. Interwar military attaché reports employed essentializing Balkanist assumptions, describing, for example, the, quote, morally inferior and primitive qualities of Yugoslav soldiers who were supposedly motivated by hatred, brutality, and love of violence. This preconditioning played a role in how the army leadership approached occupation policy after the invasion and partition of Yugoslavia in 1941. I think the army's employment of martial race theory to favor the recruitment of Serbs as irregular forces can be explained as much through this Balkanist paradigm as through the army's colonial experience. Military intelligence reports also relied heavily on Balkanist stereotypes to explain the outbreak of revolt in Italian zones of occupation. Resistance was, they argued, the manifestation of the region's endemic brigandage and the instinct of Balkan people who, quote, refused to suffer any form of government. We also see Italian military authorities adding new features to their Balkanist framework in response to circumstances they encountered during the occupation. So, for example, whereas Slovenes were typically left out of most pre-war definitions of the Balkans, either for geopolitical rationale or culturally because they had not experienced Ottoman rule, the effectiveness of the Slovene guerrilla movement prompted Italian intelligence officers to slot them into this Balkanist framework. So, citing a very good expert on the subject, one intelligence report explained that the dissatisfaction, restlessness, hypocrisy, and perfidy of the Slovenes stemmed from their history of domination under the Habsburgs. So replacing the Ottomans with the Habsburgs. Italian generals similarly leveraged Balkanist assumptions to guide their counterinsurgency strategy, concluding that Balkan peoples only responded to demonstrations of force and fear of punishment. I argue that the Army's head-for-a-tooth policy established the occupied space of the Balkans as a zone of exception, where different rules applied than on other fronts. Now, it was up to the Army's propaganda apparatus to impart these justifications and assumptions onto the rank and file. So far, I've talked about this official level of discourse. Now I want to turn to the propaganda that is trying to inform the rank and file soldiers. Now, the Italian Second Army, which was assigned the task of securing Slovenia, Dalmatia, and parts of the so-called independent state of Croatia that we see on this map, this army had a propaganda office attached to its headquarters. Each corps within the army had its own propaganda section, and then division, regiment, and battalion commands all had their own propaganda units as well, all staffed by propaganda officers like this guy, Enzo Ponzi. And like other propaganda officers, Ponzi was a fascist party member with civilian experience in the communications and publishing industries. Propaganda officers considered service newspapers to be one of their best tools in reaching ordinary soldiers. Newspapers, we're talking about newspapers printed on site and that are aimed specifically at Italian military personnel. And these were potentially able to speak directly to the experienced reality of the Italian soldier in their occupied space. An early example of one of these newspapers was Per voi soldati, published by the 6th Corps in collaboration with the fascist civilian newspaper in Split. Other examples at the corps level were La Sentinella and Picchiasotto, but the most impressive and widely distributed service newspaper was La Tradotta del Fronte Giulio. It was named after the famous trench newspaper of the First World War, which we see on the left on the screen here. And the Second World War version is on the right. It was printed by the Second Army's propaganda office beginning in the summer of 1942. And these newspapers responded to soldiers' demands for more literary and satirical content, as opposed to just merely war bulletins. I believe we should take these sources seriously as artifacts of cultural production in their own right that provide insight onto the war as viewed from below. Through these service newspapers, Balkanism undoubtedly formed part of the mental universe of combatants in Yugoslavia. Balkanist rhetoric took three main guises, the first of which I am labeling geopolitical or strategic. So imperial, irredentist, and anti-Soviet themes all incorporated spatial concepts of the Balkans. Not surprisingly, army propagandists echoed the typical messages of fascism's universal imperial mission. They wrote of the Mediterranean as Italy's vital sphere or imperial space. They claimed that the Roman Empire and its civilizing mission were being resurrected by the Second Army in the Balkans. So the story that accompanied this example announced that Rome returns as a beacon of civilization and justice. The light of Romanità, exclaimed another author, would ensure the integration of Croats into an Italian-led imperial community. So these universalist claims to empire, they kind of sat uneasily with those of irredentist expansion and annexation, but both relied on assumptions about the kind of barbarian nature of Balkan Slavs. But the theme of anti-communism, I think, was more important than expansionism in the army's propaganda. And I find the depictions of the Yugoslav communist partisans particularly interesting in the way that they were linked to to the spatial imaginary of the Balkans, but also linked spatially to the Soviet enemy. Army leaders wanted to convince their men that the war they were waging against partisans in Yugoslavia was just as important as, and indeed closely connected to, the massive confrontation underway against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. To do so, they harnessed the liminality of pre-existing assumptions about the Balkans as this sort of bridge between East and West, while adding new aspects of their own. No source visualizes this dynamic better than this illustration titled, "What's Behind the Divider?" The drawing depicts two combatants locked in a vicious hand-to-hand struggle. And the Italian on the left appears to be the stronger of the two. He's wearing a uniform and a helmet. The partisan, on the other hand, is shoddily attired. His clothing is poorly patched, and his footwear is in tatters. But the real meaning for this piece of propaganda is provided by the dividers, or screens, that are flanking the two belligerents, with these arrows that you see pointing to Europe on one side and to Russia on the other. Europe is seen as this gleaming mountain defended by well-drilled troops and lots of artillery, trucks, and ammunition. Russia, on the other hand, can offer only human cannon fodder, represented by a pile of skulls. This divider was symbolic, I think, in three ways. First, it acknowledged the sentiment within the army that their war was kind of hidden from the other fronts, that the soldiers in the Second Army were being forgotten. Secondly, it reassured Italian soldiers that their side had all of Europe behind them, and that ultimately the Axis was still the stronger. And thirdly, it equated the soldiers' struggle in the Balkans with the existential clash of civilizations being fought on the Eastern Front. In fact, the Italian soldier in Yugoslavia was seen here as Europe's first defense against an Eastern, inhuman communist menace. And here the Balkans were portrayed in a very literal sense as this liminal battleground in the wider war. So the way that What's Behind the Divider illustration tried to build a sense of group cohesion within the Second Army around this lamentation that their work in the Balkans wasn't being acknowledged back home. Well, we see kind of a similar dynamic being deployed in the way that propaganda represented the topography of the Balkans as well. Italian propaganda focused quite a lot on the natural environment of the Balkans, which it invariably depicted as rugged, rocky, hostile, cursed, and depressing. So this illustration depicts Yugoslavia as literally a pile of rocks. The service newspapers presented these environmental features as shared hardships that all soldiers of the Second Army endured. Articles wrote about long marches through mountainous terrain that tore up the soldiers' boots and provided the guerrilla enemy with plenty of opportunities to lay an ambush. Clearly, the propagandists were trying to mobilize the physical environment to establish a sense of comradeship and group identity within and across the Second Army. Indeed, more so than in those corps or division-level newspapers, it was the Second Army's newspaper, La Tradotta, that frequently made these direct references to the Balkans, as opposed to talking about more specific locales. So the troops of the Second Army were presented as being "we of the Balkans." There were plays and short stories that were set in simply the Balkans. The fictitious sponsor of this photography competition was called Balkanaya Perfumes and Beauty Products. The newspaper launched a special color issue to celebrate Christmas in the Balkans. And the editor's Christmas salute to their readers emphasized these themes of comradeship and belonging within the space of the Balkans, saying, "Today, the Christmas holiday brings us even closer together wherever you are in these Balkans, in which we have lived for more than a year and a half. We see you in your garrisons in Slovenia, in Croatia, in Dalmatia, in Serbia, in Herzegovina. We stand beside you in the isolated little posts along the railroad, in the frontier posts on the wind-beaten roads, in the guard posts. All of you, we see all of you comrades in arms of the Balkans. So you have this sense that, no matter where you are stationed in the Balkans, the experience of this shared hardship imposed by this geographical space was meant to be a unifying one. The spatial imaginary of the Balkans was not just connected to hardship, it also interacted with concepts of race and ethnicity. I argue that the spatial imaginary of the Balkans interacted with and converged with pre-existing anti-Slav discourse in Italy. Propagandists tended to link the ruggedness of the terrain to the savagery of Balkan peoples. The story that went along with that earlier drawing of the pile of rocks, the story actually complained, it says, there's nothing here but rocks. You turn around and you see rocks, and in front of you yet more rocks. To the right and to the left, wherever you look, rocks and then more rocks. But then it concludes, where do you expect people with good morals to be born? So, this example highlights the propagandist's attempt to connect topography and cultural characteristics, to connect space and race. Another example described the Balkans as this land that we cannot love, inhabited by people that have nothing in common with us, filthy drunks, scoundrels, traitors that neither feel physical pain nor share the refinement of our race. So propaganda highlighted the differences between Italians and the occupied populations and expressed contempt for the, quote, social chaos that was considered to be an age-old Balkan trait, as opposed to being brought about by the rupture of invasion, partition, and occupation. Now, although propagandists declared that hate was apparently a Balkan word, they tried very hard themselves to inspire racialized hatred of the partisan enemy and the populations that abetted or accommodated them. The army was obsessed with the cowardly ambushes of the partisans and with the atrocities they allegedly committed. The newspaper attributed these practices to ethno-racial characteristics in a region where, quote, human flesh has as much value as tree bark, and where primordial savage massacres were customary to these barbarous and primitive people. These references to the kind of old bloody instincts drew on Balkanist assumptions of barbarism and savagery that intersected, as we have seen, with anti-communism, and as we see in the example on the screen here. So we have all of this propaganda that's deploying this Balkanist framework to inspire hatred, fear, expansionistic zeal, and camaraderie among Italian personnel. But of course, this raises the question, did the soldiers actually buy into any of these messages? I mean, measuring the reception of propaganda is always a challenging task, and there is reason to be skeptical. Many post-war accounts claim that soldiers simply rejected top-down propaganda coming from the regime out of hand. Historians largely agree that the Second Army was a demoralized and inefficient fighting force. It has also been suggested that conscript soldiers from rural backgrounds may have felt sympathy for Yugoslav peasants whose homes and crops often were destroyed during anti-partisan operations. On the other hand, several studies of soldiers' correspondence from the Yugoslav front have highlighted the prevalence of anti-communism and the fear and loathing of partisans. Soldiers' letters often echoed Balkanist vocabularies describing the rugged, dangerous, and devastated landscape, describing the wild people of the region, and making these comparisons to Russia that we've seen in the propaganda. And quite a few soldiers actually did respond to the call of their propaganda office to submit stories, poems, and drawings to the newspaper. That's what we're looking at here. More often than not, their contributions kind of fantasized about just returning home. They wanted the war to be over. But the Balkanist rhetoric was there too. So propaganda may not have promoted enthusiasm amongst the soldiers, but it did provide, I argue, a vocabulary and an interpretive framework that they could use to make some sense of their experience in occupied Yugoslavia. So, to sum up my conclusions, I've argued that the Italian military leadership was influenced by this pan-European discourse on the Balkans. I then showed how propaganda familiarized rank-and-file soldiers with Balkanism, which it mobilized in several ways, right, to justify imperial expansion and fascism's civilizing mission in the region, to explain the resistance of communist partisans, and to connect their counter-guerrilla war to the larger confrontation against the Red Army on the Eastern Front, to foster comradeship and group identity around shared hardships, and to justify harsh reprisals against Balkan partisans and populations. The spatial imaginary of the Balkans thus provides an important framework to understand how Italian combatants interacted with the Balkans as an occupied space. Thank you.